Hi, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome, depending on whether this is your first session or hopefully your sort of a multiple session. Welcome to Cultures of Energy 9, New Directions in Energy Humanities. I'm so pleased to be here with you for the plenary panel, Energy Humanities, what it's been, where it's going. And it's no exaggeration to say, and the reason I'm so pleased to be here with these guests is that it's no exaggeration to say that our plenary speakers, Stephanie LeMenager, Imre Szeman, Karen Pinkus, and Dominic have been defining figures in the field and have inspired, instructed, provoked, and most importantly, they've mentored, supported, and encouraged new work. And so as we've thought about this Cultures of Energy as a way of highlighting emerging work, but also thinking about the voices who have helped the field emerge and who have supported those new voices, I'm so pleased that we're all here together. And that sort of mentoring and encouraging is some of the most important work we do. So I'm grateful to these scholars and teachers for the work that they're doing. We thought it would be important at this Cultures of Energy, marking our 9th occasion, but our 10th year of Energy Humanities work at Rice, to assess the state of things. Our panelists have been given a very general charge, so general it may not count as a charge, to reflect on the state of the field, its past and futures, through the lens of their own writing, teaching, editing, and reading. But I also had knowing them all on the page and some of them in person, I knew once we were in a room together, a fantastic conversation would emerge. So what I'll be doing first is I'll introduce all of the speakers, and then they'll present in that order. Each will have 10 or so moments to share their reflections with you, and after that I'll invite them to some crosstalk with one another before lobbing at them some questions and bringing to bear your questions. So as you're listening, at any point, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to register any comments or questions, and we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. And for our panelists, let me just say, please understand the brevity of my introductions in inverse proportion to the regard I have for you. So, to start, Stephanie LeMenager, her work on climate change and the humanities has been featured in the New York Times, Climate Wire, Science Friday, NPR, the CBC, and many other public venues. She's the Barbara and Carlisle Moore Professor of English and Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of Oregon, where she co-directs the Center for Environmental Futures with Professor Marcia Weisiger, an environmental historian. Publications include Living Oil, Petroleum Culture in the American Century, Manifest and Other Destinies, and excuse me, and Environmental Criticism for the 21st Century, a co-authored essay collection for scholars, and also Teaching Climate Change in the Humanities. And I want to just say quickly about two of these. Living Oil is a real classic already in energy humanities, a young field as it is. It's an incredibly important and instructive book. I also want to say we hosted here our first environmental pedagogy conference, and as I was working with colleagues and with graduate students to plan that, we were really looking at things like Stephanie's fantastic Teaching Climate Change in the Humanities. So I really always appreciate my colleagues who are not only such important scholars, but really important teachers, right? And who inflect all of their work as a kind of teaching and mentorship. And I appreciate that immensely. And I'm also excited for the book she's working on. Maybe it's coming out, I don't know the dates at all, but So Much Stranger Than Fiction, a meditation on the fate of fiction in the shadow of climate change. Welcome, Stephanie, so glad you're here. Next up will be Imre Szeman, a university research chair and professor of communication arts at the University of Waterloo. In his areas of research, since many of you know him, won't be a surprise: energy and environmental studies, social and political philosophy, critical theory and cultural studies. In addition to serving at the University of Waterloo, he's taught at McMaster University, the University of Alberta, and he was the Leverhulme Visiting Professor in Critical Studies at the University of Glasgow. What I can say about Imre, which I've had the great pleasure of occasionally hearing him and meeting him, but I don't know him very well. What I can say is that is what many of us can observe from the outside and marvel at what a prolific writer, teacher, mentor, and builder of networks that he is. As a writer, here's what he's published since 2016 on petrocultures, globalization, culture, and energy culture, art and theory on oil and beyond, with Dominic, energy humanities and anthology, a really important sort of work. Also fueling culture, 101 words for energy and the environment, petrocultures, popular culture, after oil, that's all from 2016. And what I can also say, again, just from the outside, is I'm constantly amazed by the people I become connected to in one way or another, who are collaborators of Imre's or students of his. And I'm just sort of so impressed at how supportive he is and what an incredible network he's been building in the field. So Imre, welcome. I'm so pleased you're here in the conversation. I'm really happy to sort of welcome Karen Pinkus back, professor of Italian and comparative literature at Cornell University. She is also a minor graduate field member in studio art, which suggests also kind of the wide-ranging nature of her interests, and a faculty fellow at the Atkinson Center for Sustainable Future at Cornell University. She's the editor of Diacritics and has done such wonderful things since she took over with it. And she's been an important voice working between Italian studies and environmental humanities, and also, I'm so happy to say, as a fellow early modernist, as an early modernist who works across important histories as well in her work. She's the author of Clocking Out, The Machinery of Life in 60s Italian Cinema, Fuel, A Speculative Dictionary, Alchemical Mercury, A Theory of Ambivalence, Picturing Silence, Emblem, Language, Counter-Reformation, Materiality, and several other books. I'm also happy to say I got the chance to meet Karen here at Rice University when she was hosted as a visiting scholar at SENS, where, if I remember correctly, she was doing a lot of the work that became Fuel, a really marvelous and inventive way of thinking through fuel and what scholarship is and what a dictionary is. So I'm so pleased Karen is here back with us. And I should also say she's completing a new book tentatively entitled Subsurface Narrative Climate Change Between Critical Theory, Geology, and Geography. And last, but definitely not least, Professor Dominic Boyer, my colleague here, an anthropologist specializing in energy, climate, politics, and society. With our colleague Simony Howe, he completed a large NSF-funded field research project on the political culture of wind power in southern Mexico. He's currently working at researching competing models of electricity provision and their social implications in Europe, in Europe, the United States, and Latin America. And with Dr. Mark Vardy, he's doing NSF-sponsored field research in Houston with victims of Hurricane Harvey. Of the many, many things I could say about Dominic, his impressive publications, the incredible podcast that he and Simony sort of created, which is an incredible resource for many sort of people within energy and environmental humanities. The sort of co-filmmaker of Not Okay, about the loss of Iceland's first major glacier to climate change, and then also very importantly part of an important and very newsworthy memorial to that glacier. I can say that 10 years ago, when things were kicking off, first with the Sawyer Seminar, and then later with SENS, which he directed from 2013 to 2019, Dominic was an incredible colleague, always supportive. And when I didn't know quite what my energy and environmental humanities interests were and how they were coalescing, he was always supportive of projects and encouraging to all of us here. And I appreciate so much both Dominic on the page in the classroom, but also as a leader here at the university. So Dominic, I'm so pleased you're part of the conversation too. And with that, I will disappear and we'll kick it off with Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Lemonisher, coming to you from the unceded territory of the Kalapuya peoples here at the University of Oregon. And I should warn you all that I have two dogs who like to bark when I speak. I think they think I'm barking and they're going to join right along with me. So my apologies if that happens. I'm going to just kind of outline what I want to say today and then try to get through as much of it as I can in a short period of time so that I don't start us off on a time lag. I'm going to first talk a little bit about the personal origins of the book, Living Oil, then its intellectual surround, and then some legacies that I see coming from that intellectual surround, not so much my particular book, but the sort of cross currents that it came out of. And then I'm going to end with two concluding questions. So Living Oil started as an extremely personal project for me. I was living in Southern California, where I had been living on and off since I was 16 years old. I didn't really understand or feel myself in that place. That was one problem that I was trying to address. I was getting to know my father again, with whom I'd had a longstanding sort of rift, and my father's life was shaped profoundly by becoming involved in a family oil business located out of Conroe, Texas, near Houston. His family was in some ways saved from poverty by their small role in this oil business. And that was interesting to me, learning his story. I was experiencing what I think we now understand quite in a quite academic fashion as climate grief. The Gulf of Mexico had been a childhood place for me, both as a sort of displaced Texan and Floridian. And after the BP spill of 2010, and before that, the devastation affected by Hurricane Katrina, I was feeling a kind of almost a kind of crying every day grief for that place. And I also, like many of us, I think, was feeling democracy grief, something that's been very clearly represented in the Trump era, but that was also present even in the Obama era, which seemed so much brighter than the Trump era. And I specifically was reacting to the Citizens United decision, also 2010. On a more literary front, because I am a scholar of literature and I remain committed to that, I was reading a lot of peak oil imaginaries, a lot of literatures, and looking at art and comics where different people or collectives were thinking about life beyond fossil fuels in ways that were sometimes exciting, sometimes dystopian, but always interesting. And so those were the sort of personal practices and I guess I'll say feeling states that brought me to write Living Oil. And in a disciplinary sense, the book was a test case for the degree to which literature and other media can be considered as what we might think of as documentation of feeling states, and I'm thinking a little bit about Raymond Williams and structures of feelings here. Documentation of feeling states, of cultural imaginaries, of culturally specific subjectivities. The book was also a test case for the degree to which site-specific practices can be enacted in literary critical writing, practices that included field work, actual site visits, interviews, museum visits, in addition to visits to local archives, which don't have the sort of status of the archives that we're usually encouraged to visit as young professors. And the intellectual surround of Living Oil was a rich one. And, I want to give a lot of credit to all of the people who were working in varied fields that influenced the creation of this book and its particular contribution to the energy humanities. I think there are a lot of different styles of energy humanities work, and mine is a very specific one that has had some sort of second generation iterations. I was very influenced by post-colonial studies. I did an undergraduate degree in anthropology and worked with Renato Rosaldo, and it was pretty much impossible from that point on to think of the United States as anything but a colonized and colonizing nation. And so post-colonial studies was kind of where I understood the work to be. Ken Saro-Wiwa, Amitav Ghosh, Rob Nixon, Jennifer Wenzel kind of came up with me, were all strong influences on my work. I was also influenced by situated practices. I mentioned a little bit about what this meant to me, but I was trying to model myself a little bit after the Center for Land Use Interpretation, some of their work, some of the work of people I had come to know at UC Santa Barbara, like Lisa Parks, Dr. Lisa Parks, who does really interesting field work in infrastructure studies and was doing that while I was there. The Los Angeles Urban Rangers became a cultural geography / performance art group that I got involved with in Los Angeles and whose methods to some degree I wanted to mimic, but again, in the guise of a literary and media critic. And I also was influenced by material feminisms. I had gotten to know Stacey Almo's work. She was just creating Bodily Natures at the time. I had read the work of Nancy Tuana on porosity, and was quite interested in that work. And finally, affect studies. I didn't know that affect studies was a field when I was writing Living Oil. I've since learned that it is, of course, but I was reading people like Kate Sandilands on queer eco-melancholy. I was reading Jennifer James on Black eco-melancholy. I read Teresa Brennan, who I had met when I was a grad student at Harvard and who died in untimely and early death, but has done some terrific work on the affects, the bad affects of globalization. Later on, of course, I would read Lauren Berlant and Kathleen Stewart. And that was the surround that I was kind of working within. And what I see is moving forward from that, and this isn't necessarily my sense of the futures of energy humanities. I think that other people should be talking about that, and I'm going to be going to the afternoon panel where I suspect that we'll see some of that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as sort of, I don't know, adjacent projects that are related in some respects to the same intellectual surround that I just mentioned. Um, One would be decolonial studies and all of the profound work, both in activism and in scholarship, on indigenous resurgence and indigenous sovereignties. And I think, you can name various people. There's a wonderful interview with Nick Estes and Jasker and Dillon that Simony Howe and Dominic Boyer did on the Sense podcast, which is a terrific resource. Of course, both Estes and Dillon also have written wonderful books about both energy and climate justice and the necessity of indigenous sovereignties being at the very center of those projects. I think about Dr. Macarena Gomez Barres and Barres, and the fascinating work that she does on the extractive zone and the submerged perspectives that it doesn't really see or acknowledge, a kind of energy undercommons, if you will. Decolonial studies also include settler scholars like Heather Davis, whose really wonderful work on plastics is information. Heather Davis happened to be the faculty visiting scholar at my center at University of Oregon this year. And I'll mention two other people that we awarded prizes to at University of Oregon. Tiana Bruno, Dr. Tiana Bruno is a student of Laura Polito's. She's in geography. She just got a position at University of Texas, Austin. You all at Rice, I hope you get to know Tiana Bruno's work. Terrific work on the US Gulf Coast and the legacies of enslavement, even to the degree that those legacies permeate the flesh of trees. She does biochemical analyses of trees in addition to cultural and geographical histories of the Texas Gulf Coast. And finally, Dr. Belén Naroña, who is a scholar who's worked with indigenous women in Ecuador, looking at the ways in which their traditional knowledges are helping them to survive the violence of extraction in that country. Belén was the postdoctoral fellow for my center this year. And I think in relation to decolonial studies, and you can probably see this in terms of the people I've just mentioned, there's a wonderful scholarship of Black resistance specifically to petro-modernity and alternate Black genealogies of energy modernities. Somebody I've worked with who I know is working with Imre is Walter Gordon. I was fortunate enough to sit in on his dissertation defense. But I think we could also think about writers like Octavia Butler and the work that's been done on them in relation to climate justice by scholars such as Shelley Strebe. I also think that the work of Bernice Johnson Regan and Toshi Regan to create an opera version of Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler is a really important contribution to potentially popular culture and performance culture around questions of particularly anti-Black racism and climate justice. And of course, at the heart of Parable of the Sower is the crisis that is ongoing in a country that denies the unsustainability of fossil fuels. So in terms of the surround of situated practices and places that I've seen that move, we've had a whole set of people who've kind of studied with Lisa Parks and are doing infrastructure studies in different ways, Nicole Staroski being one of them, who does terrific work on the material weight of the internet, among other things. Now writing a wonderful book about heat. We also have really interesting pedagogical experiments, like the field experiments and field work that's being done at the Penn Environmental Humanities Lab under the directorship of Beth Wiggin. And I'm thinking particularly about the work they're doing on the Schuylkill River as an aspirational site of post-oil futures, as well as energy justice futures. That's fabulous situated work. Material feminisms continues to be a powerful force in the environmental humanities. Some of Stacey Almo's work that's developed since Bodily Natures. I think particularly of the whole concept of carbon heavy masculinities is really wonderful to think with, and was so incredibly needed, particularly when we're seeing Donald Trump every single day on our Twitter feeds. Still needed, and of course he's still very much a presence. Affect studies, of course, also continues, and I want to talk a little bit briefly about some other sort of offshoots of that, in my view. All of the work that's been done on energy subjectivities, I think first of Catherine Yusof and Catherine Yusof's work with Nigel Clark on pyrosexualities, on subjectivities subtended by coal. Really interesting work there on energy subjectivities. I think of the artist Brett Bloom. I happen to have his chapbook with me right here. Brett Bloom, who's been doing work on deindustrializing our sense of self as an artist. I also think about Ashley Dawson's Radical New Subjectivities for an Energy Commons. And finally, in a different register, the work of Sarah J. Ray on climate, grief, and various affects of this current moment of difficult aspirational transition. And finally, I think coming from affect studies to some degree, or at least working adjacently to it, are all of the work that's been done on paracapitalist social formations. There's so much work that's been done on commoning. I think again of Dawson, Jedediah Purdy and his notion of the Commonwealth, Robert Marzek on inhabitancy. I've just myself published on commoning, and then there's all the work that's been done on multi-species communities, most notably, I suppose, by Anna Singh, but in addition by some really wonderful earlier in career scholars like Karen Bollander, who works as a conceptual artist. And of course, if we think about paracapitalist social formations, we can also think a little bit about things like the Green New Deal. So that's where I'm going to stop in terms of legacies. I guess the questions I'd want to leave with are echoing Dipesh Chakrabarty of yesterday. How do we get to transition, and what kinds of arts or humanities interventions speak to that question? And I'd also want to ask a question of scale. And I think in the absence of a desire for national scale narratives or power at the level of the nation state, I'm curious about what the scale of political desire is and how the arts and humanities contribute to that. And I think Karen may be speaking a bit to that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I also meant to say in your introduction, I'm so impressed with what your center does. So I just want to say it's really amazing to see that work unfold, but we might get to talk about that a little bit later. Imre, please jump on in.
All right, thanks very much. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land I'm on here in the West Kootenays in British Columbia is the traditional territory of the Katansha, the Silex, and the Sinixt peoples, as well as other Aboriginal peoples and Métis peoples. So I'm really excited to be on a panel with colleagues from whom I've learned so much and from whom I continue to learn. And as Stephanie mentioned already, there's a wide range of approaches represented here, which I think is going to lead to a really exciting discussion. Stephanie's mapped an incredible range of work in the energy humanities, and I also love her last two questions, which I hope you have a chance to discuss at the end. I think I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach to the question that we've been posed in the title of the session, which I hope will add to the discussion, and which I perhaps took a little bit too literally, but I hope that'll be okay. So one way that I've described my work in the energy humanities, my own work, is that it tries to enact a critical theory of energy. So from its origins, critical theory was defined by, at least the way I see it, as two key ideas about its practice. First, it wanted to engage in social and cultural analysis with an explicitly political intent. It wanted just not only to understand the forces and processes that shaped social forms and practices, but it wanted to do that for emancipatory purposes. This was social analysis that wasn't neutral. It wanted to understand the commitments and dynamics of power in order to make something different possible. Now, all of us listening in on this session, and my colleagues as well, this might be kind of just ready to hand understanding of what they do as thinkers. But I just kind of wanted to draw this out, that this isn't necessarily the only way in which one looks at any topic, including energy. One can look at it in a kind of a neutral fashion, simply understanding it. I think the comments, I don't want to anticipate them, but some of the comments I think Karen is going to say talks about the dangers of this kind of social science approach to energy. But one can also look at these same dynamics in order to understand what can happen next, the emancipatory potential of this kind of critical analysis. So that's just the first of the commitments of critical theory. A second is, and I kind of guess it's linked to its political mission, is that critical theory was always, and is always alert to the limits of theory. It's permanently attentive and attuned to the positivisms and utilitarianisms to which all kinds of analyses are vulnerable. It was aware and is aware of the damage that concepts can do when heuristics are mistaken, whether accidentally or deliberately, for facts of nature. So a critical theory of energy, specifically, it's never content with seeing energy as just a topic of study for the human sciences. I've never seen energy humanities as a discipline or a field or a subfield. And to the degree it starts to emerge as such, it makes me very uncomfortable. And I perhaps, there's kind of a mea culpa here about my role in helping to develop it as seeming to be a discipline or a field or a subfield. For me, energy humanities was and is, and I hope it will be, a critical orientation. It's one that challenges dominant narratives about what energy is and what it's for, what it does and what it doesn't do, and how or if we should care about it, and just what the consequences of energy use might be for the environment, but also for history, politics, culture, and society as well. I wanted to kind of frame that general idea, this kind of two-pronged approach to what a critical theories of energy is, because both of these dimensions are what I'm concerned with now going forward. So I don't want to make any big claims about where the energy humanities are going. I think that would be presumptuous. But I've been reflecting about this sense of a specific, of the commitments of a critical theory of energy, and thinking about how they are reflective in my own work, my own worries, my own preoccupations, and maybe this will be of interest to the rest of you. So again, the two dimensions are kind of a practice that's always already political, and the other is a kind of attentiveness to certain kinds of dangers of conceptual creep or of a mistaking of a heuristic for a reality. So let me speak to the first one. So this year, I think, I take it, marks the end of the age of oil. Bill McKibben was the first to make this announcement in January in a New Yorker article, in which I think he too quickly commented on the first steps on the environment taken by by US President Joe Biden. But it's a claim that's been made by others since, including the editorial board of the Toronto Globe and Mail, which on May 22nd pondered what the end of the age of oil meant for Canada, a country that's long tied its fate to resource extraction. This article, this response by the Globe editorial board's article, it was written in response to a 200-page report issued last week by the International Energy Agency, or the IEA, titled Net Zero by 2050. Subtitle is A Roadmap for the Global Energy Sector. The IEA was established by the OECD in the wake of the '73 oil crisis, and it was given the task to provide data to member countries about the state of oil markets. And given that initial framing of a task, it's interesting that where this agency now stands is that it appears to have given up on oil. In its annual report from 2020, the annual report is called the World Energy Outlook. The subtitle of this year's report appears there as one of a series of scenarios. So that is net zero's emissions by 2050. Other possible scenarios could emerge as well. But just a year later, this transition to renewables, it became the only scenario worth considering. It's a shift, of course, whose significance, all of these shifts, it's not been lost on those involved in the game of energy. And there's been a lot of pushback, which we're only beginning to see there's only the beginnings of this as this kind of new age starts to emerge. But I do think there's this sense that, at least in some respects, that renewables have won the day, and the story of energy would now place them from now on at the center of action. Now, this is not something to celebrate. What has concerned me, or what I'm kind of preoccupied with now, is that this struggle that's emerging over what the new energy age will look like, and who gets to participate in the form it'll take. Energy humanists have a role to play in unnerving and unsettling the socio-political narratives and imaginaries which are now being written about the age of renewables. I think some critical attention that has been paid towards oil will need to shift to solar and wind and other renewables. And this is indeed what a number of scholars have already taken up, especially, I think, anthropologists working in Africa. Renewable energy societies do not automatically mean just or equitable societies. And the idea that there's somehow an obvious link, which I see often, this connection between the coming of solar or wind and suddenly a very different kind of society, an equitable and just one. This kind of link is one that we need to interrogate and unsettle. The possibilities that the end of oil opens up is something that I'm trying to learn and think about. And I'm finding it to be much harder than I imagined it to be. A lot of the vocabulary that I've been working with, and I think some of the work that I've been coming across isn't quite helping me to do this. And so I find myself, believe it or not, reading, well, I can just read like Bill Gates and people like this. I don't think Bill Gates is an energy humanist, but nevertheless, I'm learning something about the kind of claims that are being made by people like himself and by Michael Bloomberg and others who seem to be rushing to write narratives about renewables. But there's something else I want to talk about, or I've been thinking about, with respect to new political narratives about energy. In the shine of this potential new age of solar farms and Green New Deals, there's other narratives that are emerging. One has to do with some sense of a necessity of violence for environmental action. And we can perhaps talk about that at the end, but I'm thinking here especially of the recent books by Andreas Malm, but there's also descriptions of environmental violence that have appeared in a number of environmental fictions as kind of a way to bridge the gap between scale and the necessity of speed. Violence is starting to be seen as a mechanism for attending to that in a way that the language of politics, which, like in the IAE document, pushes things off to 2030, 2050, 2100. The other kind of, there's a violence, and the other kind of narrative that I've been trying to make sense of is the adoption of environmental discourse by the right in a growing body of eco-fascist literature. I don't mean literary fiction, I mean in kind of writing by eco-fascist groups. Eco-fascism, it's not only being promulgated by non-state actors, it's, for example, a key element of the current Alberta provincial government's attack on what they view as an anti-Alberta energy global conspiracy. If you visit the website of the Alberta government's public inquiry, which it has set up specifically to investigate what they see as this anti-Alberta conspiracy, you'll find reports, extended reports, multiple reports that check all the usual boxes about how the right understands how the world works today. So we get reports there telling us that instead of telling the truth, journalists, and the presumption being environmental journalists, but it goes beyond that, that journalists are carrying out the wishes of elites and lying about energy, about the importance of energy and of a certain kind of energy to the world, which is, of course, is oil and natural gas. So these elites include Prince Charles and George Soros, the World Economic Forum and the UN Children's Fund, and of course, that supposedly most dangerous of groups, which are cultural Marxists. Such rhetoric isn't always explicitly anti-environmental. It can be pro-nature as well. Nature is an element of a blood and belonging, pro-nationalist, anti-immigrant sentiment, all wrapped up in a romanticism that I worry can or might speak more easily to the sensibilities of those with a more common view of the environment. The environment is a place one enjoys on the weekend and which can be damaged by too many bodies, especially of the wrong kind. So these are the kinds of anxieties I have about the topics, the present politics of that the energy humanities has to attend to, and which I'm trying to make some sense of. I've also been trying to think about this second theoretical element, the critique of a certain kind of fixity of conceptual approaches. And I'll go back to the very beginning without going on too long. It's always interested me that that immediately following the scientific discovery of energy in the mid-19th century, it came the desire to use energy to explain everything. There immediately were social theories that used energy as that used the idea of energy as a universal descriptor of all of being, to kind of promulgate and to explain how the social world is, but also how it should be. And one of the best examples of this work is by the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Willem Ostwald's book called The Energetic Basis of Cultural Analysis, which is from 1909, where he connects the universe and society through the idea of craft or work. So there, and with all kinds of repercussions that came out of that, about managing the laboring bodies, about specifying what they can or can't do in relationship to the optimal use of energy, and all tied up in a single theory of energy, which can explain how everything works. Now, such articulations, we might see them now as laughable, but also dangerous. And though it might be, I might be kind of overstating this, I don't think what is happening now is anything like what Ostwald and others like Eugene Solvay were doing. I do worry at times that some aspects of energy humanities are in danger of similar kinds of attempts to explain it all, if in a more nuanced and sophisticated way. The link that's often made today is a different one, and this perhaps picks up on one of the questions that Stephanie stated at the end of her presentation, though she stated in a much more sophisticated way than I think I'm going to go at it. So the link that's often made today is different, I think, and that is that there's a tendency to connect a critical analysis of energy, whatever topic that might be, with the political efficacy of such criticism. And to just give one example of what I have in mind, in the recent essay that Jennifer Wenzel and I wrote, we interrogated the way in which the term extractivism seems to very quickly become the name for every process and practice through which value is generated for capitalism. So we asked in this essay whether, given the conceptual ubiquity of extractivism, whether it serves any analytic function or whether it just gets in the way. It seemed to us that one of the reasons why scholars in the humanities have recently become so interested in extractivism, in this term that they've used to pull together everything from the contemporary politics of extraction in Latin America, so neo-extractivism, to the way in which one gains meaning from a poem. You extract meaning from a poem, you extract meaning from the soil, you extract work from a body. The work that this kind of general term extractivism does is perhaps that it connects up how one's scholarly work, at least we argue, that it makes one's scholarly work have a resonance quickly and directly to a sense of, to this gathering sense that we all have a planetary environmental crisis. So we ask, whether assessing a literary text fulfills the political mandate, which environmental studies, environmental humanities, energy humanists might have taken on, might have assigned to themselves. But the limit isn't with a literary analysis, is undertaking a critical discourse analysis of the new IEA report that I just mentioned any better. I certainly believe that all of the work of my colleagues, the fantastic work that Stephanie has given us an account of, I hope my own work, all of this work in the energy humanities has a political intervention to make, without question. But perhaps one of the best ways to make sense of that political intervention and to make it as powerful as possible is to also be attentive to an overreach that may well impede this politics rather than amplify it. And I'll leave my comments there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Imre. Karen, please jump on in.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And I consider Rice kind of my second or maybe even my first home in academia on bad days. So I miss you all, and I really have learned so much from being there and from the connections that I've made through being a visitor there, and also from the various conferences over the years. I couldn't really be where I am without you. So I'm going to be a little bit briefer, I think, than my esteemed colleagues, and maybe a bit more impressionistic, because I also wanted to react a little bit to what I've heard over the last day and a half. And so I will, since Stephanie started this out, I could give a little bit of a personal narrative, because to prepare for today, I looked back over my old documents and found that June 2006, I had applied for a grant for the Future Fuels and Energy Initiative at USC. It was the first time that I had ventured into this field, and my computer, like mine, says that's 15 years ago. So I had put in an application for this initiative by the USC provost, and I had used a kind of language that I find fairly abhorrent and I'm somewhat ashamed of, which was, the ability of the humanities to contribute to this discussion among scientists and to help communicate and have this pedagogical value. But of course, I did get the grant, and not only that, but they said, well, you applied for so little money. I mean, don't you want more? And I really didn't know what I would do with it at the time. So that was how it all started for me. And I did move away from the work that I said I was going to do on this grant, and thought a lot about climate change. But of course, I did come back to fuels and energy and have continued to do so. So it's been a long time for me. And thinking about that, it seems like not a very long time, because time is moving quickly. So I also, like Imre, took our charge a little bit literally to think about where this field is and where it might be going. I feel I have seen, I think, a growing divide between the academic field of energy humanities, which has been developing with many interesting scholars, and a general public understanding of energy, which still really lags behind. So in some sense, this is the same old problem that we've seen with other areas of the humanities, that there's this specialist discourse. We speak to each other, we use a language that's difficult, we make certain assumptions, and yet the general public still has a really unclear idea of what energy transitions are, what energy justice is, what causes climate change. And of course, as we all know very well, this lack of clarity in the public sphere is not just an accident, it's something deliberately deployed by the oil industry and others who support them. So there is still, even though I wrote my book and my mother and maybe 10 other people have purchased it, there is still an incredible lack of understanding of the distinction between fuels and energy. And it makes me even more determined to think about how we could disentangle those terms, as I tried to do. There's still a lot of mystification and mystifying going on. For example, I still see the persistence always popping up of what I've called the alchemical analogy, this magical transformation of some matter that's not good, like say CO2, into something that is a useful or marketable product, say. And each time I see this alchemical language or a chemical analogy pop up, it's as if the writer thought of it for the first time. So that's part of this divide, right? But at the same time, and I really enjoyed the passion and commitment of the graduate students who spoke yesterday about the publishing that they're doing. I'm not convinced, and I'm going to be a bit provocative, and I'm happy to walk this back or to have more of a conversation, but I'm not really convinced that it's our job to reformulate the ways we speak or the language we use for public-facing activities. I still believe that we have a certain rigor that we should stick to. And I say that, understanding that people need jobs and people need to find ways to think things to do once they've received a PhD. So this plenary also asked us to look forward. And for me, I guess, and a bit like Imre, I'm uncomfortable with predictions, but I also wonder if it's possible to separate this kind of activity from the kind of, let's say, professional futurology, which is also linked to, say, things like scenario planning or forecasting or expertise culture or a kind of tech bro ethos of startups that has certainly infected academia. And again, I say this acknowledging that we need to adapt to the climate of the academic job market, but also the climate of a post-pandemic university and the fate of the humanities. So to some degree, I suppose forms of forecasting are necessary for quote unquote saving the humanities, but to be provocative, I wonder whether the humanities under this kind of culture is actually worth saving. I mean, who are we saving it for and why? And I'll also note, for example, that a lot of this discourse on futurology was developed in the Cold War period as an alternative to, let's say, Marxism or a Marxist view of history. And so I think we need to be very careful about when we utilize it. So in my own teaching and experiences in academia, I have certainly noticed a drift of the humanities towards the sort of soft social sciences. I mean, I can just give one example. At Cornell, we have a new humanities scholars program, which was given in a gift, which was developed from a gift from anonymous donors. And we have, I think, choose 30 students each year to be a part of this program. And looking over the applications, I see more and more of them are basically coming from fields that I would consider the social sciences. And so what does that mean? So there's a risk that subfields such as energy humanities are complicit in this movement toward the humanities becoming forms of social science. And the risk is heightened, I think, when we talk about things like field work, critical journalism, public-facing humanities, skills, or new audiences for the work that we do. All of these terms are symptomatic of this drift. And again, perfectly understandable and not necessarily bad terms, but I think are can tell us something. At the same time, the humanities are defined as what is not science, for whatever that might mean. So yesterday, Professor Chakrabarty made a remark that many humanists don't know about climate systems, and that may or may not be true. I would say many people don't know about climate systems, even well-meaning citizens or even activists. But what if we flip this, and again, excuse my being provocative, and said many scientists don't know about narrative or the unconscious or language or critical theory, as Imre outlined it so eloquently. They don't know what the archive is and why the archive is a problematic term. They don't really know what it means to think historically and to think in speculative terms. So if we flip that over, what do we get for the humanities? And where does that leave us? So in this spirit, I am going to call or again, open up the possibility that we return to the impractical humanities, including readings of literary texts from the past. And here, I think Joe's work, for example, and he might have more to say about this, is really crucial, and the work of other, say, early modernists. But even people who are reading literary texts to think about, say, energy, where energy is not explicitly a theme. Or let us return to long periods of immersion into research of various kinds that do not immediately yield results. Now, of course, scientists do this too. And scientists have risk of failure built into their work. So in that regard, I think the humanities has more in common with the sciences than with, say, the social sciences. But what about a return to a kind of work that may not be immediately translated for a general public? As someone said yesterday, can my mother understand this? Well, again, my mother will purchase my books, which is very kind, but why should we have this kind of discourse that is available to, and Dominic is a slightly an outlier here, because he actually, I think his father would and does understand his work, but I think you're a bit different from some of us. So work of this kind that I'm talking about takes a really long time. It requires us to maybe go to archives. It should, I think, really require us to learn a language. And I mean, not just learn a language for reading, but to have an immersion in foreign languages and foreign cultures, and to explore archives that may not yield anything of use and may lead to self-doubt. So in calling for this kind of work around energy, I realize that it may seem like this does not have any political or, that this may not in fact satisfy what all of us want, which is change. And it may not have this political dimension, but I would argue for a kind of politics of critical thought theory in agreement with Imre. And I would ask then, if we say that we don't have time for this now, what are we really saying? And I'll leave it there.
Karen, thank you for those great provocations. I can't wait to get to the conversation. But before we do, on to Dominic.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone, and thanks to my colleagues for wonderful, wonderful remarks. So many details here that I'm still processing. I wanted to just acknowledge that Houston, where I'm speaking to you from, where Cultures of Energy has been based, is on the unceded lands of the indigenous peoples known as the Sana, the Arakapa Ishak, the Kua Huitekan, the Karankawa, and the Akokisa. I want to thank, as the last person in sequence here, I have to just step out of role a minute and just thank Joe and all his colleagues in Rice Humanities for making this possible. I say this as somebody who was responsible as a principal organizer for the first 8 of the Cultures of Energy series, and it was wonderful to not miss any sleep last night and to just kind of enjoy myself to be able to come in here because of all of the heavy lifting you're doing to keep this series going. And I do think that alongside the petrocultures the series, that the Cultures of Energy series is one of these things that kind of keeps giving the field momentum and shape and opportunity for really, really important conversations. So thank you, Joe, and thanks to everyone else who's played a role in this. So I too, I have a background before I started work on energy and environmental issues. I was working more on knowledge and intellectuals and media matters. And so when people ask me to sort of think about the last 10 years of a field, I immediately begin calculating sort of networks and centers of gravity and trying to think about the different kinds of epistemic terroir that sort of inform conversations in the field. And I guess I would just say, and this is really just doing a worse version of what Stephanie has already done, but maybe at a kind of more sort of telescope back to say, I've been really glad to see, this field develop into such a thriving area of research and conversation over the past decade. I think at the time when Szeman and I first began working on wind power in Mexico in 2008, 2009, it felt as though, there was some really interesting work on oil that was out there. There was people were beginning to pay attention to renewables, but there really wasn't, nearly the sort of number of people who are engaged with this problem now. And I just find that incredibly encouraging. I mean, whatever else we might want to say, I think that the fact that the humanities have really risen and that humanistic social sciences have really risen to the challenges of the era. And I think we ought to, not be too shy about, actually saying, that's been a good thing. And that's been something that I think has really made this, we've helped to bring, at the institutions that we inhabit, we've helped to put energy more on the conversation, on the sort of topic of political, strategic, cultural conversation than it was in the past. I think that's a really good thing. So, I mean, basically, I see, at least two incredibly vibrant areas within energy humanities today. One of them, I would say, is roughly speaking Marxian, political economic. It's looking at the relationship between energy and capital, at resource politics, fossil capitalism, and sort of devoting really important critical attention to those matters, like helping to reveal certain structures of oppression that are longstanding, but also, not being not faltering at wanting to engage the possibility of revolutionary politics, politics of infrastructure, movement politics that could disrupt the fossil status quo and begin to bend the horizon towards something. What could it be? As Imre was saying, celerity, topic of one of the more recent petrocultures events, and that movement from fossil to celerity, within a Marxian framework, sort of always has a bit of a Hegelian vibe to it. So we have to be a bit cautious about to what extent this teleology must, as we've been suggesting, be questioned. But again, on the other hand, I like to sort of, as a naive optimist in a lot of ways, I like to, well, there could be worse things to dream about than a turn to celerity, right? So maybe we should also indulge ourselves a little bit along that front. But the other body of work, and the one that I think has really been absorbing me a lot of late, is the research that has deep kinship with feminist technoscience studies, its attunements to new materialism, to more than human relationships, to the kind of intimate affective codependence of our forms of modernity with certain kinds of energy and fuel, as both Karen's work and Stephanie's work have shown us in really profound ways. And I also really, appreciate how feminist energy humanities has asked these really fundamental questions about the epistemics of what energy is in the first place, and really questioned their kind of masculinist, imperialist bent. This idea of energy as work, and Kara Daggett's, book, The Birth of Energy, is what I have in mind here, as well as taking on, again, I think in a really vibrant way, an attempt to think, well, maybe we can retrieve something of older conceptualizations of energy, pre-modern conceptualizations of energy, or look forward then towards something different, towards what a truly post-work ethos of energy could look like. And I think that is important, that we sort of don't allow that energy conceptually to be determined by sort of the industrial modern work order, and the whole instrumentarium of things that do stuff for us. Beyond what energy can do for us, I think we have to think about what's the ethos of energy that's appropriate to times, to living on a damaged planet, to trying to repair relationships, and to be in good relation with our other fellow beings and with the ecosystems of the world. I don't think these approaches are at all at odds with one another. I think they have different kinds of analytical tensions. They foreground, they background certain issues. But if we're thinking, as Imre was suggesting, about energy humanities not as subdiscipline, just a content bag into which we all dump, our latest and greatest findings, but rather as a kind of a critical orientation towards modernity itself, then I think they both do that. And they both mightily challenge the contemporary petropolitical order, but they do it in different ways, and they do it in ways that I think help each other, honestly. I think that there's a complementarity here that I wouldn't want to lose sight of. So those are two sets of conversations that are so vibrant, and I'm looking forward to watching them continue to iterate and unfold as the next decade takes shape. I also really enjoy the fact that, as I said back when things started, it was sort of oil and other, and now I feel as though there are all of these new analyses of the different, what I like to call energopolitics, of different kind of energopolitical issues. So you've got people working on the plantation economies of the 16th and 17th century, going back to the sort of historical formation of the modern energetic order, but then also people looking laterally and forward at the politics surrounding electricity, the Electrify Everything campaigns that are going to certainly be a big part of our conversations of the next few decades. New kinds of energy, the geothermal energy, the marine energies, sort of analyzing the cornucopian fantasies that may be associated with these, as they have been with solarity, but also the true possibilities for different kinds of political and social forms that might accompany them. I think somebody's got to look at hydrogen, because I'm seeing everywhere suddenly hydrogen is the new thing. Like it's what carbon sequestration was 5 years ago. Suddenly all the oil companies are talking about hydrogen as their kind of bridge to the future. And I'm thinking, okay, now we need to look at hydrogen. So it's not going to stop. And the relevance of energy humanities won't stop. The opportunities for engaging with the politics of our time won't stop. And I think that I'll just end on this point, that really the pitch for energy humanities has never made more sense than it does today. I think increasingly, and this maybe speaks to one of Karen's points too, it's true that we may have a problem with language and with jargon and with translation, but I do think at the level of a kind of affective understanding of things aren't working, or the trajectory is pointing towards a crisis and worse. I think that understanding is more general, and it's part of what's informing, the eco-fascist potentials, as well as, the anti-eco-fascist potentials on the left. So, we live in troubled times, but I also think we live in epic times, and we have to just appreciate sometimes that we are living at a moment when rarely has it been the case that people have been demanded to transform a civilization in the way and in the depth and scale and temporality that we have. So I think that part of this has to be something that we can become excited about, because it is a creative exercise as much as it's a critical exercise. And so, this idea that technology markets won't save us, because these are cultural, epistemic, habitual, institutional problems deeply rooted in this history of bad colonial and crypto-colonial relations. I mean, this is all stuff that, I'm sounding cheery, but it's terrifying. Just to be clear, this is a terrifying situation we're in. But I do feel as though, this particular network of energy humanists is one of the reasons why I I can sleep at night is because I can look around and I can see the brilliant people working seriously at this problem, devoting, if not their whole life's work, but a big chunk of their life's work to these issues. And I think, well, this is the place to be. So with that, I'll turn it back over and see where the conversation might go. But just a thanks to everyone here for all you've done to help shape this field.
Maybe as I sort of just open this up for all of you to talk one another, I'll say one really quick thing, which is, and it's something that Dominic's just made me think about all of your presentations to have, which is, even as we gave you this sort of impossibly big task in a short time, I'm getting at some of the inadvertent accelerationism I think Imre was talking about earlier. This is just evidence of also something Karen was talking about, which is that hard, slow, and serious are still really important, whatever the forms of engagement and writing and whatever else happens in this crazy time on the planet and in the academy. This is all really just evidence of what the importance of hard, slow, serious conversation. That is the best definition for me as a scholar, is someone who is in conversation with the past, with others, with maybe not the future, right? That's a complicated thing to talk about, but I appreciate that so much about these presentations. Tons of things I could ask about, but I first want to just open it up and allow any of you to sort of start talking to one another and just getting this conversation going. And I'll sort of jump in here and there perhaps and start to keep an eye out for the Q&A. So that also all of you in the audience, please, the attendees, please start logging in on the Q&A. A couple have popped up already, and we can't wait to hear what you've got to say as well.
Stephanie, would you remind us of the two questions you ended with? I feel like they crossed over a number of the discussions, especially, I believe the first question was something like, what kind of arts and humanities do we need to help the transition?
Yeah,
something like that.
I was, thanks so much, Imre, for bringing that back to us. When I was listening to Dr. Chakrabarty speak yesterday, the question of transition is central, as he said, but then, how do we get there, and how long does it take, and does it take too long? And of course, that produces the question of violence that you raised in your terrific contribution today. But I think, I'd like to think a little bit about transition, and I'd like to think a little bit about how transition plays a role in what we're doing, or doesn't. Are we thinking with transition the work that we're doing?
And so I won't really follow up on that. I just want to ask your other question, because I think, again, these all speak to one another. You ask about the scale of the politics.
Yeah, I think the scale of political desire is something that I've been thinking a lot about. Right now, I'm involved in an oral history project on Oregon's public lands that grew out of the Malheur occupation by the Bundys and company back in 2016. And I've been going along around the state with a historian, environmental historian named Marshall Weisinger. And we've been talking to various people, getting, conversation going about what the public lands have meant to them, what sorts of futures they would like to imagine. And it's been very clear that in this region, perhaps in particular, but I would say it's probably a national problem, if not one that has international aspects to it. There's just a tremendous distrust on all political sides of state power, of the federal government, of any kind of futures that are allied to national narratives. And you see this on the left, you see this also in the extreme right. At the same time, people are telling us that, for instance, Lucas Oil was out in Eastern Oregon cultivating a ranching family out there who supposedly were the cause but for which the Bundys came out to Harney County, Oregon, and occupied the Malheur Reserve. So we know that there are these problems of sort of political scale being represented by alternate forms of sovereignty and narratives of alternate sovereignties. And on the other hand, there's the way in which this creates a landscape where some of our corporate actors have even more free reign to kind of come in and tell their own stories and seduce publics. And this raises a lot of questions for me. You know, I'm just kind of thinking through this on the ground with the people that our university serves here in Oregon, but also as a person who's quite interested in story forms, both from my anthropology background and as a literary scholar. You know, I'd like to think a little bit about how we are or are not called upon to consider problems of political scale and desire.
So I'll just say one thing and then I'll let others speak. I did get this sense across at least my presentations, Stephanie's and Karen's. I'm not sure about Dominic's, but I think it's there that there is this tension between the hope that our work can participate actively in politics and quickly and at scale. And so that's why there's some of what you suggested, Karen, about a certain type of older academic practice, just not bearing that burden and allowing itself to do what it does. I think that some of how environmental studies has constituted itself, whether kind of as an unconsciously as a practice, maybe less than consciously, is that it wants to be involved. It wants to contribute its specific kind of expertise to what is, after all, an area completely about expertise. Some great books recently about the environment speak to how much post 45 it gets produced as right away as something that experts do. You know, experts assemble and share ideas. The IPCC is nothing if not a constitution of experts, COP process, and so on. So we want to have our own expertise valued and participate in a very, very active way, but that might go against some of the other things we value in our practice. I kind of see that as some of the dynamic. And then the question of scale interested me so much because I think the other part that disables that political desire for me is, where do you put it? So just really briefly, I have two kind of little personal experiments happening right now. One is I have a new permaculture farm, which I have no idea how to run, but it's interesting to fail at doing it. And farm overstates what it is, but it's about half acre of an older permaculture farm. And it has very little to do with academic knowledge. And the other is being involved in the Green Party of Canada. And there again, it's unclear what I contribute from my academic practice as opposed to another kind of practice. So I can kind of do some general gestures, but that's it. And so then I kind of trying to think back what the other kind of critical practice I have to do does. You know, so for me, models are cultural studies at its origins in the work of Stuart Hall, critical theory at its origins in terms of trying to address totalitarianism. Maybe those didn't have the same bite that I think they do, or I hope that they do, and maybe our work doesn't either. But how do I make sense of this in terms of my own practice? So that's a lot of what I heard today.
It's an important tension I was thinking about earlier. So as Stephanie started, I thought, yes, these are sort of my critical points too. I find so much of my work inflected by the personal, by thinking about corporeality, about affect, about style. And then, and that kind of incredible phrase of Dipesh Chakrabarty's yesterday, the body is the first site of forgetting of planetarity. So we put all of that, what's so much about, by the way, also, I've been a poet and a literary critic, right? So what's so much about those fields starts to feel so not a lot, right? It's almost a way of distinguishing between the good kind of humility in the face of that which is so outscales us versus feeling a kind of uselessness about what we do, so that we get a good impracticality, right? As maybe Karen's talking about, that has to do with humility, that has to do with thinking powerfully about scale and well about scale, but that is also not about the kind of easy depression of sort of the smallness, our smallness relative to the problems we think about and face. In any case, Karen, you might want, I think you were maybe wanting to jump in a little bit earlier.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that even the term transitions is a term that we might use in one way, but the public would use in another way. And it might be opposed to a kind of violence, whether that's actual, activist violence or putting your body on the line, or a kind of critical violence. And so I think it's a problematic term. And precisely because of that, I mean, echoing really what you said, Joe, is to embrace, I guess, the contradictions that we live with, rather than trying to somehow overcome them or brush them aside, and recognize that they are part of a larger problem. But especially when we think about sort of the future of the humanities, to not simply say, well, we need to become more useful to other disciplines, or we need a seat at the table with those who are making policy. I mean, again, I would almost put it the other way, like they should be knocking on our doors to have a seat at our tables, if we have any tables left, in the future that we can sit at. So yeah, that's again just a provocative response to even the very term, transition.
Sure, Stephanie, please jump on in.
Sorry, thank you so much. Let me now lower my hand. I've been learning my students' frustration about the hand that never lowers. I think it also depends on the specific institutional community that you're living in. And I'm living in one that is highly activist, and it's one that that does not have patience for the slow work of academia much of the time. And that doesn't mean that I simply pander to that, but I think part of what concerns me about my students, I'm not really that concerned about my expertise. I don't know why, but I feel like at 53, I've done well enough. I don't need to prove much to people at this point in time. I don't even need to think that much about my own professional longevity. 10 more years, so that's not really the issue for me. But the issue is, how do I get my students through the day? How do I give them tools for writing, for thinking, for imagining, for critique truly as a means of getting through crisis, and I think there's an element of that that's just, it's urgent, and the urgency is because, again, maybe our region in particular, maybe this is a left coast problem, I don't know. It has been really, since I started teaching in California, now in Oregon, the case that I have highly activated students with, at times, deep levels of depression and despair that are enunciated every single day in the classroom. And you may have that too. I don't want to make assumptions about that, but I feel like some of the things I'm hearing, though I don't disagree with them, and I myself, I'm very eclectic. I went to Harvard, for Christ's sake. I certainly had a very conservative sort of, impractical education, which I actually really liked for the most part, and it has inflected the way that I read and think. But I would also say that, you kind of have to hear what is happening around you. And I feel like whether I want to be living in place or not, I am, and I always have been. And so, those are kind of where the questions are coming from for me. And for us in our region, the question of just transition, which is really about socialism or eco-socialism, is everywhere. Now, I know it isn't everywhere. I know that we are unique, but But that does create an interesting environment for discussion and for pedagogy to develop within. And for me, it's resulted in a kind of dual practice of speaking across and writing across registers. I mean, Living Oil was meant to be a well-written book, but it certainly isn't a book that a lot of people read, I don't think. I mean, I don't see it as a public book, a book for the public. I think some of my pedagogical practices are public facing, and I think that field work has become necessary in a region where so many people actually are unheard by the educational institutions that are meant to serve them, because we have such a huge rural population here, and we also just have a kind of, I'll say, regional pride that, connected with that rural population, actually asks for relationship with the university. So I'm just kind of throwing this out there, that I think living and teaching in place and thinking in place is it presses upon me in a very specific kind of way.
Oh, this hand raising, it's so orderly. I love it. No, but Dominic, please just jump on in.
You're so orderly. Yeah, I'll just really briefly, I'll just say that, to sort of react to those last set of remarks. I mean, that I think, one of the things you don't want to get, I mean, the entire apparatus of professionalization, not just academic professionalization, but professionalization across the board, wants you to believe that expertise is a zero-sum game, right? You have to, you can only do so much, and it has to be just this one thing. And I think that's part of the resistance that has to be mounted, is to say, actually, you can do more things as an academic but that it's not like it doesn't matter. Do your impractical work, it's great. But then if you also are going to do some writing or do some teaching or give a talk to a church group or write an op-ed for the newspaper or make a little film. And the other thing is that it's not just about you, that it's so much, again, the kind of neoliberal just all comes on the shoulders of the individual. Collaboration, let's collaborate. There's so many artists out there who want stories to tell, who are looking for people with interesting perspectives, and I think that's something that we have in abundance. So I'll just say, I think that it's kind of a part of the overcoming the concerns about practice is just thinking, I think, expansively about what practice could be.
So I'm going to try to start looping in a few of the questions, since this is a great conversation and we're burning through our time fantastically quickly. So let me just sort of start. Okay, first off, for you, Dominic, a bit of a sort of fan statement. Can we get a relaunch of the Cultures of Energy podcast? So you don't have to comment on that or respond, but just so you know that that's out there. But let me ask a question from Zeynep Ogyuz, who gave a great paper this morning on the Emergent Ethnographies of Energy panel. Following up on Imre and Dominic's remarks on Bill Gates, ecofascism, techno-utopianism, etc., I wanted to ask all panelists the kinds of patterns they notice in emerging and dominant narratives on green energy and energy transition. We've started talking about that a little bit, as urgent, important areas where the energy humanities can intervene. So let me lob that one out for anyone who wants to jump in on it.
I always love the easy questions that we get asked. I'll just say really briefly about this. The Bill Gates book Bill Gates makes one move that is indicative of the entire field of a kind of a self-anointed professional class that is now saving us when governments can't. There's one paragraph, he says something to the effect of, there seems to be some kind of political problem with energy, solving energy problems. He says it almost as if he's confused by it. And then he says, I'm not a political scientist and I don't really understand this. So I'm just going to focus on these kind of technical solutions. And I'm pretty sure with all these technical solutions, we'll manage everything. So I know it sounds like an easy stereotypical way to go at it, but it definitely is out there that there is a process, extra state process, by which developments will take place. That then goes along with a state process, which is much less clear about its aims and ambitions, I think, and is reactive to the sense that Dominic pointed to, which is that there's something unnerving about what's happening now, and that there needs to be a whole set of practices and protocols rolled out by states, either to contest what's happening or to kind of amplify it. And everybody's trying to get in on the action as to what that might look like, not necessarily cynically. And that's, to me, makes it even more confusing. I mean, why are we talking about this Bill Gates book? But Bill Gates has some very interesting ideas, actually, but none of them are informed by any sense of politics. For the record, Dominic, he's not a fan of hydrogen. He lost a bunch of money in an investment that he gave it.
I feel like I should be asking Bill Gates, the fifth panelist, to respond, but anyone else want to weigh in on that question? That's fine. Maybe we should leave Bill Gates where he is, and the trouble and complication he's in. Maybe we'll kind of get towards a close. I want to come back to something that I felt like came up in a number of the papers, both as a certain kind of practice and sort of modeling that you were doing, but a phrase that Dominic used that I was thinking a lot about, alternative models, and also in tension with, I think, something that came up in a number of your responses, and especially Karen's, the skepticism and anxiety we might want to have about certain versions of futures, which are really a certain kind of futurology prediction. We know where that comes from and where it's likely to lead. So I'd love to think about that distinction. It seems to me that you're all talking about different alternative models, that maybe is what we really need, is a proliferation, whether we're talking about within the academy or not, a proliferation of alternative models that can also live next to one another, maybe even be in conversation, so that it's not we have to give up old, slow, kind of long study hard versus new activist public facing, which is never helpful. But I'd love to think just a little bit as we close about these alternative models that seem really important. And again, some of them I think you've already started to articulate here. So I'd love to hear more about that if you could.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for the questions. I would have something to say about electricity and hydrogen, but I think, essentially it goes back to the work that I've done on trying to distinguish fuels from energy. But yeah, I guess I would ask, alternative to what? And maybe just leave it there, because the same way that we talk about alternative fuels or alternative energy. I mean, alternative to what? Is it just, we're just going to plug in something new, like keep the same infrastructure, keep the same frameworks, or are we thinking about something very different, and then again, do we transition to what is the alternative? And then if so, how do we know when we've crossed the threshold? Like, what are the metrics that we would use to know? Would it have to do with greenhouse gas concentrations, or with the percentage of energy that's generated by non-fossil sources? And how do we even account for that without, it's not so simple, right, as we know, because there's all kinds of funny, fuzzy accounting. So I guess even the notion of alternative is, kind of like alternative music. Here again, I'm kind of winking at Dominic, because we both have music past. But yeah, I mean, what is, just that horrible term, alternative music, which probably is really abhorrent. So again, what alternative to what? And that it's not just such a simple term.
So I'm going to say something that is not really an answer to your question, but I want to again ask for a restart to the Sense podcast. I've heard amazing interviews with everybody on this panel. I've also really gathered an archive for my students, archives being troubled, as we know. Nonetheless, this is an amazing, amazing resource. Szeman and Dominic, come on.
Well, Dominic, maybe you have to play us out now with a little
Oh boy, yeah.
for the podcast and the alternative.
I feel like now I'm being put on the spot. But listen, the good news is this is a conversation we've been having with increasing. I mean, we did a 200 episode run weekly, which kind of burnt us out, as you can imagine, after 3.5, 4 years. But I do think we've gotten to the point where the sort of restorative process, the regenerative process of being has gotten to the point where I think and plus, there's so much great work. And the thing that I miss about the podcast, most frankly, is just, in that way, when you're teaching, you have to read things that maybe otherwise you could just leave in a stack. And actually having to more or less read a book a week, which sounds crazy, and it was amazing in terms of just in improving my understanding and appreciation for all of the work that's going on in energy and environmental humanities more broadly. So let's make that an objective that by this time next year, we've got something going. And whether it's, putting things out maybe at a slower pace or putting things out in groups of 10 or something like that, I will make a promise right here and now that we are going to try to bring it back in some form.
Wow, talk about results at an academic conference. That's fantastic.
We need a
To
takeaway. We need something.
save
That
to
also
save
means
some
Stephanie might be
workload,
called on to be a co-host at some point because, or Karen or Imre, none of you are. You're gonna have to put up to get back on the show again.
Hey, I'd be honored.
So we've come to the end of our allotted time, and I want to be conscious of a couple things. One, that our speakers have devoted so much incredible energy and insight and shared that with us today, and I'm very grateful for that. I want to be conscious of all of your time too, because Zoom fatigue, as we know, is real. Energy is the body too. So I want to be conscious of that, and I want to be conscious of the fact that we've got one more fantastic session to close out Cultures of Energy 9, which is the session Dominic has curated on energy justice, and that's starting at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. And you'll see in the chat the link that if you haven't registered, you can now. So again, let me thank one last time, Dominic, Stephanie, Imre, Karen, and thank you for inspiring and instructing
Thank you.
us all.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for all your work, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, and we will see you all at the next panel. Good night.